On the west coast of Norway, about an hour's train ride from Bergen, lies the village of Voss, in recent years famous for its water bottles that you find all over America, but long before that, noted for its stunning nature, with snow-capped mountain peaks and roaring waterfalls. Voss looks like something straight out of a postcard. The only thing that is missing from this Norwegian Lord of the Rings landscape is a fjord. Unlike many villages in western Norway, Voss sits in a valley rather than at the end of a fjord. But the absence of fjords and salt water makes the air crisp and cold, which transforms Voss into a winter wonderland during the colder months. Despite its modest population, Voss has produced a number of Olympic gold medalists, famous for soaring off ski jumps or racing down icy slopes. It is not, however, a place you'd associate with team sports, especially not football, which in Norway goes by the name American football. Yet, this tiny winter sports village gave us one of the greatest football legends of all time, an immigrant from Norway who didn't just succeed in the sport, but even reshaped it. This episode of 200 Norwegians is about Knute Rockne. So why am I now making an episode about the sports hero? That's a fair question. This podcast is supposed to be about people who made a difference, or more precisely, Norwegians with a lasting impact. And sports is just sports, right? Football, at the end of the day, is a pretty unproductive activity. So why bother with something as seemingly trivial as a group of men chasing a ball around? Why care? I actually think we ought to care, simply because so many people already do. Pope John Paul II once said, "Among all unimportant things in this world, football is by far the most important." He was indeed talking about international football, meaning soccer, but I think the point stands. Football does matter because it occupies a huge chunk of the American mental landscape. It shapes dreams, hopes, identities, and lifestyles. And Knute Rockne recognized this more than 100 years ago. He understood that the way we play sports reflects and informs how we live life. He didn't want football to just be an arena for winning and losing, but one for discipline, cooperation, and creativity. And for that reason, he became a coach for a nation, which also happens to be the title of the sports historian Jim Lefebvre's book on Rockne. In the preface of this book, the sports historian writes that the six-letter name Rockne became more than just a name. It became a household word back in the day.
The Rockne name became known for excellence, for sportsmanship, and it really spread across the country, not just Notre Dame and their football victories, which was substantial. And then, of course, his record, the greatest winning record of any coach, pro or major college, that just added to it. And then there's the level of Rockne as a mentor to other coaches. So he created the greatest coaching tree of all time, meaning his Notre Dame players, which he helped guide into positions across the country. So you had college after college being coached by Notre Dame men using the Rockne system. What did they mean by the Rockne system? Partly it was the actual way that he coached the game of football, the Notre Dame shift, the Notre Dame box, and without getting into too much of the details of the X's and O's, but that's part of it. But in a larger sense, the Rockne system can refer to how he managed and coached an individual team and how others tried to emulate him. For example, he coached deeper into his roster than anybody else did at the time. Typical at the time in U.S. football was a coach taking his 11 usually biggest, strongest guys and playing them the whole 60 minutes, the whole game. Rockne kind of foreshadowed two platoon football by developing an entire second unit. They were called the shock troops, term from World War I, and the shock troops started most games for Notre Dame. And so this was the second 11 that he was able to develop to the point where they started the games, took the shock out of the opposition for up to the first quarter of the game, all the while you had the 11 best players on the sideline ready to come into the game fresh and rested sometime maybe early in the second quarter. It was a great psychological tool as well as a physical advantage. Rockne's regulars were kept fresher during the course of the season, had fewer injuries.
What was he inspired by? Was he inspired by other coaches, or was he inspired by even like warfare philosophy and the more kind of fringe subjects of
Yeah,
the game?
no, that's a great question. And I really take it back to his, Norwegian upbringing and the Viking outlook of, I don't want to use the word conquering so much, but of let's say exploring. His mind was always looking for something new, different, beyond the horizon. And I don't think it's too much to say that comes out of his upbringing, and just the fact. I mean, you look at his family and his dad, branching out from Voss, Norway, with the carriages that he invented.
Yes, because Knute's dad was indeed an inventor, just like Knute's grandfather, who was also named Knute. They all lived in Voss, a place that was rapidly developing thanks to the new railway to Bergen. The Rockne family was one of the oldest in the area. Since the 1850s, Knute's grandfather had run a workshop and an ironware store there. Over time, they also began to specialize in building farming carriages and horse carts. These Voss carts became widely known across the region. Lars Rockne, again Knute's father, carried on that legacy and took it to the next level. He earned international praise for his craftsmanship and was invited to showcase his carriages at the World's Fair, first in Liverpool and later in Chicago. World's Fair was a big deal back then, but the 1893 Expo in Chicago was especially meaningful for many Norwegians. It marked the extended 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' voyage, and the replica of the Santa Maria was supposed to be the main attraction at the expo. But a Norwegian Viking ship really stole the show. Captain Magnus Andersen sailed a replica of the newly excavated Gokstad ship all the way to America and into Chicago. This reminded the world that the first European in America wasn't Columbus, it was Leif Erikson, who wasn't from the warm Mediterranean, but from the cold north. For a country still fighting for their independence, this moment mattered, and for the Rockne family, the Chicago Expo gave them something more, a foothold in the new world.
So Lars himself made the trip over for the beginning of the fair, but then fairly shortly after that was able to send for his family, his wife, and then three children out of the five they eventually had, to come over a little bit later in 1893, and that's when Knute Rockne came over as a 5-year-old.
Hmm. And he arrives to a pretty interesting city. I think somewhere in there you call it a nexus between the industrial East and the agricultural West. What more can you tell me about Chicago at the time?
Chicago was a boom town. The recovery from the famous or infamous fire of 1879 was quick and bold and massive. I mean, the city just took off in not just rebuilding, but going beyond what anybody had envisioned. And as the railroad lines, really kind of made it the crossroads of America, where so many railroad lines met, and raw materials came in and finished products went out, and it just became, really central to the growth of the United States. And so the city at the time was expanding into new areas. I talk about the Logan Square area of Chicago where the Rocknes lived, and constant building, new homes, new neighborhoods. They were right there where it was all happening. A flood of immigrants coming in and being assimilated into U.S. culture as the Rocknes were. The parents took English classes at the public school in the evening, and things were happening fast, in the city, and they were typical of a family that seized the opportunity to be there. Interestingly enough, Lars did not really go on to do anything further with his carriages, and we're never exactly sure why. It could be just because there was so much other activities of well-established companies in Chicago, in Detroit, and elsewhere in the U.S., building what became automobiles at the time. But he ended up becoming what uh, Knute described as a standing engineer, and he did that maintaining the equipment at a printing operation in Chicago, which interestingly printed the largest circulation Norwegian newspaper in North America. So there was just a lot going on, and and Rockne stepped right into it.
Knute Rockne also stepped right onto the football field, which back then was often nothing more than an open lot between two buildings under construction. Improvised games between the Irish kids and the Scandinavian kids were a regular thing back then, and they could get pretty rough, violent even. Most of the local cops were Irish, and they didn't mind the games, as long as the Irish kids didn't take too much of a beating. As Rockne got older, they also formed more organized teams. The quick-footed Rockne played as an end on the neighborhood team Tricky Tigers and later for the Barefoot Athletic Club. His parents, however, were far from impressed when he came home with torn shirts, busted lips, and black eyes. They considered football, quote, a system of modified massacres, end of quote.
You have to place it in the context of the times, in that football was a very dangerous sport at the time. And I mean, there were numerous deaths and serious injuries every year in organized football, not to mention, just kids playing in a neighborhood. But the newspaper headlines at the time were, very common, with young men being maimed or even losing their lives playing football. Got to the point that in 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt convened a meeting at the White House where he brought in the leaders of football, which at the time were Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and said, you need to clean up your game or it's going to be outlawed. And that's when they developed some rules to improve the safety of the game. and also created what became the NCAA to have some organization to oversee things. And so that's the meeting that really saved football. But for years after that, there were still, there were still some serious issues around the safety of the sport. So Rockne's parents were were wise in not allowing him to play until he finally kind of wore down their defenses and got permission.
Knute Rockne's main sport in high school ended up being track and field. He was a hurdler and a half-miler. In fact, he spent so much time on sports that his academic performance suffered. And Rockne, despite showing clear signs of academic talent in his earlier years, ended up not graduating.
And so he stopped his education for a time, and for the next 4 years, he simply worked, earned money for his family by working at the main post office in Chicago, while still training as a track athlete, doing a lot of running and sprinting, and eventually competing for the Chicago Athletic Club. So there were a number of years there with no organized football, but he kept his hand in athletics through track and field that way.
Right. And as you briefly touched on there, he was a promising student. He excelled early on, but he didn't get credentials to get into the University of Chicago, as his dad, I believe, wanted him to.
Correct.
And he ends up at Notre Dame. Can you just like tell me a little bit about how he ended up
Well,
there?
like you said, the family's first choice would have been the University of Chicago, and when that wasn't possible, Rockne himself just figured he was headed to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. That's where somebody like him would go to school, and it was a couple other fellow Chicagoans who were Notre Dame students at the time who talked them into going to Notre Dame. Part and largely because of track. These were two track athletes, and they said, you could come and run with us. It'd be great. And the other driving force and main factor was what a thriving industrial city South Bend was at the time. South Bend had a number of industries, a number of businesses, and so the thought was it would be easier to find a job after college by going to South Bend and attending Notre Dame. So that's what got him there. And then he had to take an admittance test because he lacked that high school credential. He had to take an admittance test to be admitted to Notre Dame, which he finally was in 1910 at the age of 22. So as he called himself, he referred to himself as the lone Norse Protestant stepping into this center of Catholicism, amongst a bunch of other 18-year-old freshmen when he was 22.
Being older and more mature seemed to make him more focused. He picked up football again, but this time around, he managed to balance it with his schoolwork. Rockne studied chemistry, and he was by all accounts an excellent student. During his sophomore year, though, it looked like his education might come to an end. The reason was that he got word from home that his father had passed away. Knute therefore packed his bag and went to the train station, thinking he would never return.
That was an event at the time which would just, for most people, naturally spell the end of their education. A young man like that would be needed, especially with four sisters and a mother. He would be needed to provide for the family.
Mm.
He got home, and after they buried his father, two of his sisters stepped up and said, "No, you're going back to school. We're going to go into the workforce." And so one became a stenographer, I believe, and one got into sales, and they took over and provided for their mother and younger siblings to allow Knute to head back to Notre Dame.
Back in Notre Dame, Knute picked up football again, and he formed a duo with Gus Doré on the football field.
So Charles Gus Doré, his great friend and teammate from Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, is the quarterback and Rockne is the end, but not the type of end that we think of today being a wide receiver so much. They were just another lineman. But what the two of them did, and of course they never claimed to have invented the forward pass, which he didn't. Rockne gives the full credit to a team a number of years earlier at St. Louis University, which is a whole nother story. But what happened in 1913 is the rules were liberalized to allow more forward passing. Before that, if you threw an incomplete pass, you lost possession of the ball. The other team would take over, just like if it was an interception. So it made the pass pretty risky and thus somewhat rare. So they opened the rules up in going into the 1913 season. Rockne and DeRay got wind of this through their coach. And that summer, well, they were both employed at the Cedar Point Resort on Lake Erie in northwestern Ohio, is when they famously practiced their forward pass on the shores of Lake Erie all that summer. DeRay throwing these long spiral passes and Rockne running intricate pass routes, catching the ball on the fly.
In 1940, Hollywood made a movie about Rockne's life, with Pat O'Brien starring as Knute Rockne, and, by the way, a young Ronald Reagan in a supporting role. There's actually a scene in this film where Rockne and his close friend Gus DeRay practice the forward pass, gearing up for a game against the Army, the most feared college football team of that era.
We're going to beat the Army, Gus. Oh, Rock. No, we're going to beat them. I got an idea. You see all these Eastern teams like the Army are all power. Knock you down, run over you like a steamroller. All right? If you can't go around the steamroller, you can go over it. No team has ever used the forward pass as the major threat of its offense. Consequently, no team has ever had a good defense against it. Gus, we're going to pass the Army. We're going to pass them dizzy. Give me that ball.
Rock, if that works, it'll make history.
Certainly. Let's start making history. Take it.
And the two of them did indeed make history. Rockne, playing end, caught multiple long passes from quarterback Gus DeRay in the game against the Army that year. Notre Dame won 35-13, a real shocker, and a game that helped legitimize the forward pass as a central part of the modern game.
So he was a really successful athlete as well. He wasn't just a great coach.
Right, he was captain of that team and an All-American that year. And in addition to the victory at Army, Notre Dame went and played and won at Penn State, which was a big deal. And then they finished the season on Thanksgiving Day down in Austin, Texas, and defeated the Texas Longhorns to complete a perfect season.
And that marked the end of his college playing days. Rockne played a bit of professional football after that for the Massillon Tigers in Ohio, but that was pretty much it. At this point in his life, it was clear he should pursue an academic career. But he wasn't quite ready to leave the football world entirely behind. As a captain of his team and as a mentor to many younger players, he had proven himself as a natural leader. He was now seen as a promising coaching prospect.
His plans were to go to medical school at St. Louis University. However, they would not allow him to come to medical school and still be involved in coaching football. They thought that was too much to commit to. Whereas Notre Dame allowed him to become assistant football coach, head track coach, and instructor of chemistry in the prep school.
In 1915, he married Bonnie Skiles. Shortly after, they started a family. He continued to work as a chemistry instructor, but he increasingly got involved in the football program. Though he excelled in both fields, there was never any doubt where his heart was. So when he was offered to become the head coach, a role that would allow him to dedicate even more time to football, it was an easy decision. With more time to focus on the game, he also began to refine his methods and develop what came to be known as the Rockne System.
He famously said that 90% of football is played from the neck up, meaning he wanted fellows who were sharp, smart, paid attention, and discipline was very important. I mean, he wanted fellows who were going to do things the right way, listen and practice. But he just had a different vision for the game. And it was, he wanted every player to know not just their own assignment, but what was expected of the other 10 fellows on any given play. And, he wanted them to make quick decisions. And you have to put all this in the context of the times, is that there wasn't a lot of coaching that could be done from the sideline during a game. They couldn't even be running in plays on every play because substitution was severely limited. So you had to have a quarterback who was really skilled at knowing the plays and knowing which play to call, for the greatest chance for success. But Rockne wanted his whole team to be thinking that way. What's our best chance for success in this situation? So he actually coached a classroom course on football for his players and sometimes other students that would be interested in stopping by. And he would create these mythical games where he would go play by play, each play, what's the situation, what's the down, how many yards to go, what are the wind conditions or whatever the case may be, and ask for somebody in the audience to call the play for that situation. And then he'd give the result based on what he thought of their play call. Very interesting concept and something that I don't think any other coaches were doing at the time. But it was to create this sharp mental acuity for the game that he wanted from all of his players. Teamwork, timing, precision, they were all, superbly important to him. And of course, he famously said, I don't play my 11 best athletes. I play my best 11, meaning the 11 that work together best as a team for the most positive result.
And to talk about teamwork today, almost sounds a little bit almost like a platitude because you hear it all over all the time in every aspect of society, I suppose. But how common was like that concept back then? I mean, like team sport wasn't that old even at the time, right? I mean, at least not that popular.
Right. No, that's a very good point. And I think he was also visionary in that way.
Let's get this straight before we start. I don't want anybody here to think he's any better than anyone else. Notre Dame's system is based on teamwork, which is a combination of self-sacrifice, brains, and sweat.
Rockne was an avid student of the coaches that came before him, but he also found inspiration in unlikely places. In the film about his life, there's a memorable scene where he watches a group of dancers. The synchronized movement sparks an idea. And this idea would lead to what came to be known as the Notre Dame shift. His players didn't just practice this on the field. They also rehearsed it to music.
You can get this shift. I know you can. That's why I selected you for to do it. Of course it's tricky, but that's the beauty of it. If you get it, it'll revolutionize football. All right, put another dick on the slab. Let's go. Let's go, fellas. Signals. 18, 21, 33. Hip. 1, 2, 3. Faster. Hip. 1, 2, 3.
In his first 3 years as a coach, he was very successful, thanks in large to George Gipp, one of the greatest college players of that era. Gipp died of pneumonia at just 25 years old. But after losing his star player, Rockne realized he could no longer rely on individual brilliance. It was this absence that crystallized his vision of football. Built on true teamwork and complementary skills, eventually Rockne assembled a legendary team, not celebrated for standout talents, but for its unity and discipline. Most famously, this included the so-called Four Horsemen, a backfield whose coordination and chemistry became legendary.
When you look at the backfield of the Four Horsemen, and a question I'll get from time to time is, well, which one was dominant? And I literally say you cannot pick one of the four that stands out, from amongst them. They were all supremely talented, supremely versatile, and it was what they did together that really created this almost unstoppable team in 1924, along with the seven mules, is what they called the linemen, who were also vitally important to that team.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about that 1924 season and how it's unfolded and what a spectacle it must have been that Notre Dame won the Nationals?
Well, and the spectacle starts in the third game of the season, which is against Army. And now the game is played in New York City. Starting in 1923, they brought the game. It had outgrown West Point, so they brought it into the city in 23. It was held at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, and then in 24, the game was at the Polo Grounds in New York City. So it's hit the big time. Big, huge crowd of almost 60,000 people packing the, with professional baseball stadium just days after the World Series was played there. So you talk about spectacle. That was that day, October 18th, 1924, and the Army cadets, marching into the stadium in this incredible game, which leads to the sports writing icon Grantland Rice giving the Notre Dame backfield its famous nickname, the Four Horsemen. But what a lot of people don't realize, first off, is that was only the third game of the season, and Notre Dame played 7 more games. If they had lost any one of those games, the Four Horsemen would have been just, I guess, another colorful name for a backfield, but they wouldn't have been legendary, and they wouldn't have been national champions if they had lost any of their succeeding games, which were against some really tough opponents, including Georgia Tech, the one of the dominant teams in the South, Nebraska, their great nemesis, who they lost to the 2 previous years, and then ultimately Stanford, coached by Pop Warner, in the Rose Bowl. So again, it was week after week of these challenging games, and many in big venues across the country, and Notre Dame found success in each one of them.
After their victories, Knute Rockne was coined the king of college football, a source of immense pride for Notre Dame. During this era, the Protestant-born Rockne also converted to Catholicism, further deepening his bond with the Catholic University. It was also a powerful statement at the time when the Ku Klux Klan wasn't just targeting African Americans, but also Catholics and immigrant communities as well. Rockne, in the following years, received plenty of job offers, but he turned them all down. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And when it came to coaching, he kept that promise. But Rockne did go many places. He traveled a lot. He was a techno-optimist, fascinating by innovation, and he loved to fly. He made frequent trips to Hollywood, where he was welcomed like a star. He and the Four Horsemen appeared in several ads after their championship run. Together, Rockne and the Four Horsemen became national icons, fueling the rise of college football during a decade of cultural change in America.
You mentioned in your book that the 20s were obviously it was obviously a very like transformative decade. And like we call it the Roaring 20s for a reason, I suppose. But it was also very transformative for football specifically. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and how the game kind of got a different status in the American society, let's say?
Well, a statistic I like to quote is that in 1919, Rockne's second year as head coach, the total attendance for the entire season was around 56,000 people. 10 years later in 1929, the total attendance for the season was around 560,000 people. So a tenfold increase in 10 years. So, obviously that's never going to happen again. It was just unprecedented growth. And you had universities, not cities, universities building these large concrete and brick stadiums. So it's the Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Michigan, University of Illinois, University of Minnesota, University of Chicago that are building these big stadiums. Rockne worked for a number of years to convince Notre Dame that football was here to stay, wasn't just a passing fancy, and then it might make sense to build a stadium, that was more permanent than the wooden bleachers of Cartier Field that they played on. And ultimately, they get Notre Dame Stadium built in time for the 1930 season, the only one that he coached in it before his untimely death in 1931. But it's just taking off across the country, and then radio comes online too, and that is a huge factor in increasing the population. Now it's millions of people sitting in their living rooms across the country listening to these games, at all these far-flung places, and falling in love with the game. And it took decades for professional football to catch up with where college football was, even in the 20s and 30s. It was football at the time. And all of this is concurrent with things like greater leisure time for Americans as the 5-day work week comes into play, thanks to the unions of the time. And suddenly people have their Saturdays open that they can attend things like football games. So it's a confluence of factors all happen at the same time.
Hmm.
And one of these factors was undoubtedly also Rockne, who became a media darling.
He was always good for a lively quote, colorful quote, so they knew he was someone, to talk to. And then once radio started, he got involved in that as well. So that, combined with his, successful teams, he just became someone, who was off quoted. And then he did writing himself. Now, whether he used a ghostwriter or not, but his name appears on a lot of articles, especially for the magazines as well. You had the weekly magazines like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post and others that featured him. So almost everywhere you turned, again, in the newspapers, in the magazines, and eventually in radio, is how he connected. And then his summers were spent conducting coaching schools across the country. So on college campuses across the country, for 1 or 2 weeks at a time at each place, he would conduct these coaching schools. So that connected him with this whole nother layer of young football coaches, as well as the media in each of those places that were literally coast to coast. Thus we name my biography of him Coach for a Nation, because he truly spread himself out and could be anywhere in the U.S.
Part of Rockne's appeal was not just his commitment to the game, but his ability to see it as more than a game, but also as an arena for human flourishing. Football, once seen as a game of modified massacres, as his parents once put it, was starting to earn a new reputation in society. It was increasingly becoming a family sport.
He really developed an ethos of athletics, of athletic competition, that said, the only way to win is to win with integrity. to follow the rules, to show sportsmanship, to think of the other fellow, the competition. He was known to do things like sit down with the opposing coaches after a game and share some of his strategy with them after having beaten them. Things that are unheard of today.
After the historic victory in 1924, Rockne continued to lead many successful teams, winning the vast majority of their games, earning him the highest winning percentage of any football coach in the history. But it would take another 5 years before he captured another national championship.
Right. Well, 1929 was very interesting because Notre Dame didn't play a single home game. That was when Notre Dame Stadium was being built and Cartier Field was being disassembled. And so they played all their games away from Notre Dame. 3 ostensible home games at Soldier Field in Chicago, and then the rest across the country. And the other challenge that Rockne had himself that year was a severe case of phlebitis, inflammation of the veins in his legs, which would be easily treated with some medication today, but back then was a debilitating disease. And he actually had to miss a couple of the games. And his great assistant coach, Tom Lieb, stepped in and coached the team in those victories. And they went through the season undefeated and were acclaimed national champions. And then the next season, 1930, they continued their unbeaten streak and went 10-0 that season in the first year of Notre Dame Stadium. So it's very notable from that standpoint. And again, were the dominant team in the country and won the national championship. So they had about a 20-game winning streak and back-to-back national championships under their belt when Rockne died in March of 1931.
Yeah. And he wasn't an old man when he passed away. He was only 43 years old, and he was on a plane. Can you tell me a little bit more about his last journey and what he was doing?
Right. He was making a trip to Los Angeles, and yeah, talk about multitasking. He had a number of different things on his agenda out there. One primary one, he's going to talk to one of the movie studios out there about their plans to do a movie on Notre Dame football, which did get made and was called The Spirit of Notre Dame. But he was also out there representing Wilson Sporting Goods Company to help open up a sporting goods store. He had speaking engagements to groups out in the Los Angeles area. And he was reconnecting with great friends like his former assistant coach, Tom Lieb, who was then out there coaching at Loyola, and just a number of different things. And then he was planning on the way back to stop in Kansas City, where his sons were at a boarding school, and he sat on the board of directors and was going to be speaking at their winter sports banquet. So all these different activities, and the trip was partially via train, partially through airplane. Of course, relatively new at the time.
Mhm.
So he took the train into Kansas City, and that's where this flight originated. And just in the first leg of it, they ran into some fairly serious weather, and it put just too much of a strain on this plane, literally constructed of wood, of plywood. I mean, it sounds crazy at the time, but planes were just not as we know them at the time, and the weather caused damage to the plane, and they lost control and crashed in a farm field in eastern Kansas, and all 8 people on board were killed. Yeah, there he was at age 43. Probably the most prominent American up to that time to die in a crash of an airplane.
The death of Knute Rockne was a national shock, and the campus of Notre Dame was overwhelmed with grief. Several thousand people attended the funeral, most of them standing outside the church, unable to get in. Many more paid their respect from afar.
Knute Rockne has gone. And who was he? Ask the President of the United States, who dispatched a personal message of tribute to his memory. Ask the King of Norway, who sends a special delegation here to represent him. Ask the thousands of newspaper men, whose labor of love in his memory has stirred every heart in America. But above all, ask the men and women in every walk of life. Ask the children, the boys of America. Who was this man whose death has struck a nation with dismay and has everywhere bowed heads in grief?
There was good that came out of it, and that it helped the federal government create the Federal Aviation Administration and put in some standards for the construction of planes, for the maintenance of planes, and for the investigation of accidents, none of which really existed before the crash. So having claimed such a prominent American, it did lead to a total change in the way air travel happened in the US.
Apart from being an author and a sports historian, Jim Lefebvre is also an executive director of the Knute Rockne Memorial Society, an organization dedicated to preserving Rockne's legacy.
The reason for being for the Knute Rockne Memorial Society is to memorialize this individual and all that he stood for, and to preserve and promote the legacy, which is important. It's important to Notre Dame because it really helped. He really helped put the university on the map and created a level of excellence which, at its best, the university strives for in all of its activities. And then in the broader sense, again, hearkening back to just what he saw as the possibility for athletics. And again, not an end in itself, but a means to greater education, greater achievement, molding young lives, leading people in the right direction. I think all those things are part of his legacy.
Okay, that's it for now. For those of you who want to learn more about Rockne and honestly American history, I highly recommend you to read Jim Lefebvre's book, Coach for a Nation. This episode was produced in collaboration with Notre Museum and with the support from Norway House Foundation out of San Francisco. The music you're hearing in the background was composed by Jan Skoglund.